down on the outside. Down in the center. Fast. Fast off one. Right, left.
What's up, everybody? Welcome back to A People's Historian, the show where we read about 30 minutes of history together. I'm Jason Kishineff, and we are going to start Chapter 5 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, entitled A Kind of Revolution. Remember, if you liked the episode, hit that like and subscribe button, and let's dig in. The American victory over the British Army was made possible by the existence of an already armed people. Just about every white male had a gun and could shoot. The revolutionary leadership distrusted the mobs of poor, but they knew the revolution had to appeal to slaves and Indians. They would have to woo the armed white population. This was not easy. Yes, mechanics and sailors, some others, were incensed against the British, but general enthusiasm for the war was not strong. While much of the white male population went into military service at one time or another during the war, only a small fraction stayed. John Shy, in his study of the Revolutionary Army, said they grew weary of being bullied by local committees of safety, by corrupt deputy assistant commissaries of supply, and by bands of ragged strangers with guns in their hands calling themselves soldiers of the revolution. She estimates that perhaps a fifth of the population was actively treasonous. That's quite a figure. John Adams had estimated a third opposed, a third in support, a third neutral. Alexander Hamilton, you wouldn't get it if you didn't see it, an aide of George Washington and an up-and-coming member of the new elite, wrote from his headquarters, "Our countrymen have all the folly of the ass and all the passiveness of the sheep. They are determined not to be free. If we are saved, France and Spain must save us." Nowadays, they'd call that colluding with a foreign government. Sorry. Slavery got in the way in the South. South Carolina, insecure since the slave uprising in Stono in 1739, could hardly fight against the British. Her militia had to be used to keep slaves under control. The men who first joined the colonial militia were generally hallmarks of respectability, or at least of full citizenship. That's all in quotes. Hallmarks of respectability, or at least of full citizenship in their communities. Excluded from the militia were friendly Indians, free Negroes, white servants, and free white men who had no stable home. But desperation led to the recruiting of the less respectable whites, but not the others. Massachusetts and Virginia provided for drafting strollers, vagrants, into the militia. In fact, the military became a place of promise for the poor who might rise in rank, acquire some money, change their social status. Here was the traditional device by which those in charge of any social order mobilize and discipline a recalcitrant population, offering the adventure and rewards of military service to get poor people to fight for a cause they may not see clearly as their own. A wounded American lieutenant at Bunker Hill, interviewed by Peter Oliver, a Tory, who admittedly might have been looking for such a response, told how he had joined the rebel force. "I was a shoemaker and got my living by my labor. When this rebellion came on, I saw some of my neighbors got into commission who were no better than myself. I was very ambitious and did not like to see those men above me. I was asked to enlist as a private soldier. I offered to enlist upon having a lieutenant's commission, which was granted. I imagined myself now in a way of promotion. If I was killed in battle, there would be an end of me, but if my captain was killed, I should rise in rank and should still have a chance to rise higher. These, sir, were the only motives of my entering into the service, for as to the dispute between Great Britain and the colonies, I know nothing of it. John Shy investigated the subsequent experience of that Bunker Hill lieutenant. He was William Scott of Petersboro, New Hampshire, and after a year as prisoner of the British, he escaped, made his way back again to the American Army, fought in battles in New York, was captured again by the British, and escaped again by swimming the Hudson River one night with his sword tied around his neck and his watch pinned to his hat. He returned to New Hampshire, recruited a company of his own, including his two eldest sons, and fought in various battles until his health gave way. He could not get enough. He watched his eldest son die of camp fever after 6 years of service. He had sold his farm in Petersboro for a note that with inflation became worthless. After the war, he came to public attention when he rescued 8 people from drowning after their boat turned over in New York Harbor. Wow! He then got a job surveying western lands with the Army, but caught a fever and died in 1796. Scott was one of many revolutionary fighters, usually of lower military ranks from poor and obscure backgrounds. Shy's study of the Petersboro contingent shows that the prominent and substantial citizens of the town had served only briefly in the war. Other American towns showed the same pattern. As Shy puts it, revolutionary America may have been a middle-class society, happier and more prosperous than any other in its time, but it contained a large and growing number of fairly poor people, and many of them did much of the actual fighting and suffering between 1775 and 1783. A very old story. The military conflict itself, by dominating everything in its time, diminished other issues, made people choose sides in the one contest that was publicly important, forced people onto the side of the revolution whose interest in independence was not at all obvious. Ruling elites seem to have learned through the generations, consciously or not, that the war makes them more secure against internal trouble. The force of military preparation had a way of pushing neutral people into line. In Connecticut, for instance, a law was passed requiring military service of all males between 16 and 60. 60 was really old back in those days. Omitting certain government officials, ministers, Yale students and faculty, Negroes, Indians, and mulattoes. Just Yale students? Someone called to duty could provide a substitute or get out of it by paying £5. When 18 men failed to show up for military duty, they were jailed, and in order to be released, had to pledge to fight in the war. Shy says the mechanism of their political conversion was the militia. What looks like the democratization of the military forces in modern times shows up as something different, a way of forcing large numbers of reluctant people to associate themselves with the national cause, and by the end of the process believe in it. Here in the War for Liberty was conscription, as usual, cognizant of wealth. With the impressment riots against the British still remembered, impressment of seamen by the American Navy was taking place by 1779. A Pennsylvania official said, "We cannot help observing how similar this conduct is to that of the British officers during our subjection to Great Britain, and are persuaded it will have the same unhappy effects, viz., an estrangement of the affections of the people from authority, which by an easy progression will proceed to open opposition and bloodshed." Watching the new tight discipline of Washington's army, a chaplain in Concord, Massachusetts wrote, "New lords, new laws. The strictest government is taking place, and great distinction is made between officers and men. Everyone is made to know his place and keep it, or be immediately tied up, and receive not one but 30 or 40 lashes." The Americans lost the first battles of the war: Bunker Hill, Brooklyn Heights, Harlem Heights, the Deep South. They won small battles at Trenton and Princeton, but the Princeton students still had to join the draft. They won small battles at Trenton and Princeton, and then in a turning point, a big battle at Saratoga, New York in 1777. Washington's frozen army hung on at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, while Benjamin Franklin negotiated an alliance with the French monarchy, which was anxious for revenge on England. The war turned to the south, where the British won victory after victory, until the Americans, aided by a large French army with the French Navy blocking off the British from supplies and reinforcements, won the final victory of the war at Yorktown, Virginia in 1781. You know, we learn in high school that the French helped us win the War of Independence, the Revolutionary War, but we don't really learn how much they helped us. Through all this, the suppressed conflicts between rich and poor among the Americans kept reappearing. In the midst of the war in Philadelphia, which Eric Foner describes as a time of immense profits for some colonists and terrible hardships for others, the inflation, prices rose in 1 month that year by 45%, led to agitation and calls for action. One Philadelphia newspaper carried a reminder that in Europe, the people have always done themselves justice when the scarcity of bread has arisen from the avarice of forestallers. Just don't tell that to Jean Valjean. They have broken open magazines, appropriated stores to their own use without paying for them, and in some instances have hung up the culprits who created their distress. In May of 1779, the first company of Philadelphia artillery petitioned the assembly about the troubles of the middling and poor, and threatened violence against those who are avariciously intent upon amassing wealth by the destruction of the more virtuous part of the community. That same month there was a mass meeting, an extra legal gathering, which called for price reductions and initiated an investigation of Robert Morris, a rich Philadelphian who was accused of holding food from the market. In October came the Fort Wilson riot, in which a militia group marched into the city and to the house of James Wilson, a wealthy lawyer and revolutionary official who had opposed price controls and the democratic constitution adopted in Pennsylvania in 1776. The militia were driven away by a silk stocking brigade of well-off Philadelphia citizens. It seems that the majority of white colonists who had a bit of land or no property at all were still better off than slaves or indentured servants or Indians, and could be wooed into the coalition of the Revolution. But when the sacrifices of war became more bitter, the privileges and safety of the rich became harder to accept. about 10% of the white population, an estimate of Jackson, Maine in the social structure of revolutionary America, large landholders and merchants held 1,000 pounds or more in personal property and 1,000 pounds in land, at the least, and these men owned nearly half the wealth of the country and held as slaves 1/7 of the country's people. The Continental Congress, which governed the colonies through the war, was dominated by rich men, linked together in factions and compacts by business and family connections. These links connected north and south, east and west. For instance, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia was connected with the Adamses of Massachusetts and the Shippens of Pennsylvania. Delegates from middle and southern colonies were connected with Robert Morris of Pennsylvania through commerce and land speculation. Morris was superintendent of finance, and his assistant was Governor Morris. Morris's plan was to give more assurance to those who had loaned money to the Continental Congress and gain the support of officers by voting half pay for life for those who stuck to the end. This ignored the common soldier who was not getting paid, who was suffering in the cold, dying of sickness, watching the civilian profiteers get rich. On New Year's Day, 1781, the Pennsylvania troops near Morristown, New Jersey, perhaps emboldened by rum, dispersed their officers, killed one captain, wounded others, and were marching fully armed with cannon toward the Continental Congress at Philadelphia. George Washington handled it cautiously. Informed of these developments by General Anthony Wayne, he told Anthony not to use force. He was worried that the rebellion might spread to his own troop. He suggested Wayne get a list of the soldiers' grievances and said Congress should not flee Philadelphia, because then the way would be open for the soldiers to be joined by Philadelphia citizens. He sent Knox rushing to New England on his horse to get 3 months' pay for the soldiers, while he prepared 1,000 men to march on the mutineers as a last resort. A peace was negotiated in which one half the men were discharged, the other half got furloughs. Shortly after this, a smaller mutiny took place in the New Jersey line, involving 200 men who defied their officers and started out for the state capital at Trenton. Now Washington was ready. 600 men who themselves had been well fed and clothed. Excuse me. 600 men who themselves had been well fed and clothed marched on the mutineers and surrounded and disarmed them. 3 ringleaders were put on trial immediately in the field. 1 was pardoned, and 2 were shot by firing squads made up of their friends who wept as they pulled the triggers. It was an example, Washington said. Stone cold. 2 years later, there was another mutiny in the Pennsylvania line. The war was over, and the army had disbanded, but 80 soldiers, demanding their pay, invaded the Continental Congress headquarters in Philadelphia and forced the members to flee across the river to Princeton. Ignominiously turned out of doors, as one historian sorrowfully wrote, by a handful of drunken mutineers. What soldiers in the Revolution could do only rarely rebel against their authorities, civilians could do much more easily. Ronald Hoffman says, the Revolution plunged the states of Delaware, Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and to a much lesser degree Virginia, into divisive civil conflicts that persisted during the entire period of struggle. The southern lower classes resisted being mobilized for the revolution. They saw themselves under the rule of a political elite, win or lose against the British. In Maryland, for instance, in the new Constitution of 1776, to run for governor, one had to own 5,000 pounds of property. To run for state senator, 1,000 pounds. Thus, 90% of the population were excluded from holding office. And we're talking about British pounds, of course. And so, as Hoffman says, small slaveholders, non-slave holding planters, tenants, renters, and casual day laborers posed a serious problem of social control for the Whig elite. With black slaves 25% of the population, and in some counties 50%, fear of slave revolts grew. George Washington had turned down the requests of blacks seeking freedom to fight in the Revolutionary Army. So when the British military commander in Virginia, Lord Dunmore, promised freedom to Virginia slaves who joined his forces, this created consternation. A report from one Maryland county worried about poor whites encouraging slave runaways. The insolence of the Negroes in this country has come to such a height that we are under a necessity of disarming them, which we effected on Saturday last. We took about 80 guns, some bayonets, swords, etc. The malicious and imprudent speeches of some among the lower classes of whites have induced them to believe that their freedom depended on the success of the king's troops. We cannot therefore be too vigilant nor too rigorous with those who promote and encourage this disposition in our slaves. Even more unsettling was white rioting in Maryland against leading families supporting the Revolution who were suspected of hoarding needed commodities. The class hatred of some of these disloyal people was expressed by one man who said, "It was better for the people to lay down their arms and pay the duties and taxes laid upon them by king and parliament than to be brought into slavery and to be commanded and ordered about as they were." A wealthy Maryland landowner, Charles Carroll, took note of the surly mood all around him. "There is a mean, low, dirty envy which creeps through all ranks and cannot suffer a man of superiority of fortune, of merit, or of understanding in fellow citizens. Either of these are sure to entail a general ill will and dislike upon the owners." Despite this, Maryland authorities retained control. They made concessions, taxing land and slaves more heavily, letting debtors pay in paper money. It was a sacrifice by the upper class to maintain power, and it worked. In the lower South, however, in the Carolinas and Georgia, according to Hoffman, vast regions were left without the slightest apparition of authority. The general mood was to take no part in a war that seemed to have nothing for them. Authoritative personages on both sides demanded that common people supply material, reduce consumption, leave their families, and even risk their lives. Forced to make hard decisions, many flailed out in frustration or evaded and defied first one side, then the other. Washington's military commander in the lower South, Nathaniel Greene, dealt with disloyalty by a policy of concessions to some, brutality to others. In a letter to Thomas Jefferson, he described a raid by his troops on loyalists. They made a dreadful carnage of them. Upwards of 100 were killed and most of the rest cut to pieces. It has had a very happy effect on those disaffected persons, of which there were too many in this country. Greene told one of his generals to strike terror into our enemies and give spirit to our friends. On the other hand, he advised the governor of Georgia to open a door for the disaffected of your state to come in. In general, throughout the states, concessions were kept to a minimum. The new constitutions that were drawn up in all states from 1776 to 1780 were not much different from the old ones, although property qualifications for voting although property qualifications for voting and holding office were lowered in some instances, in Massachusetts they were increased. Only Pennsylvania abolished them totally. The new Bills of Rights had modifying provisions. North Carolina, providing for religious freedom, added that nothing herein contained shall be construed to exempt preachers of treasonable or seditious discourses from legal trial and punishment. Maryland, New York, Georgia, and Massachusetts took similar cautions. The American Revolution is sometimes said to have brought about the American Revolution is sometimes said to have brought about the separation of church and state. The northern states made such declarations, but after 1776 they adopted taxes that forced everyone to support Christian teachings. William G. McLaughlin, quoting Supreme Court Justice David Brewer in 1892, said, "This is a Christian nation," says of the separation of church and state in the Revolution that it was neither conceived of nor carried out, far from being left to itself. Religion was embedded into every aspect and institution of American life. One would look, in examining the Revolution's effect on class relations, at what happened to land confiscated from fleeing loyalists. It was redistributed in such a way as to give a double opportunity to the revolutionary leaders to enrich themselves and their friends, and to parcel out some land to small farmers to create a broad base of support for the new government. Indeed, this became characteristic of the new nation. Finding itself possessed of enormous wealth, it could create the richest ruling class in history and still have enough for the middle classes to act as a buffer between the rich and the dispossessed. The huge land holdings of the Loyalists had been one of the great incentives to revolution. Lord Fairfax in Virginia had more than 5 million acres encompassing 21 counties. Whoa, that's a lot of land. Lord Baltimore's income from his Maryland holdings exceeded 30,000 pounds a year. After the Revolution, Lord Fairfax was protected. He was a friend of George Washington. But other Loyalist holders of great estates, especially those who were absentees, had their land confiscated. In New York, the number of freeholding small farmers increased after the Revolution, and there were fewer tenant farmers who had created so much trouble in the pre-Revolution years. Although the number of independent farmers grew, according to Roland Berthoff and John Murrin, the class struggle did not change radically. The ruling group went through personnel changes as the rising merchant families of Boston, New York, or Philadelphia slipped quite credibly into the social status and sometimes the very houses of those who failed in business or suffered confiscation and exile for loyalty to the crown. I'm going to end there. Thanks for joining me. Tune in for part 2, and in the meantime, hit that like and subscribe button and that notification bell. Thanks for joining me.